need to issue an emergency warning for this fire, over.
Bushfire. A natural hazard of potentially devastating impact, bushfire represents a significant risk to Western Australia. As Principal Research Scientist at the Department of Parks and Wildlife, Dr. Lachlan McCaw has worked with bushfires and forest management throughout the state of Western Australia since the 1980s. We caught up with Dr. McCaw on a warm summer's day at Mount Dale in the Perth Hills, which was the ignition point of a major bushfire in 2005. This
is a significant place for bushfire. In January of 2005, an arsonist lit a series of fires. The suppression efforts went on for 10 days and it drew on resources from right across the southwest of the state. It burnt through an area where we have one of the major electricity transmission corridors comes through into Perth. It affected a number of major roads and also impacted on the Mundaring Weir, putting large amounts of ash into the weir, causing erosion in the catchments of that and requiring a significant amount of work by the Water Corporation to address the water quality issues that followed in the wake of that fire. The final size of that fire was of the order of 28,000 hectares. The term bushfires is used commonly in Australia to describe fires that are burning in natural vegetation, so that might be a forest or a shrubland or perhaps a grassland. It could also be a crop or a pasture or a tree plantation. Bushfires are free burning in the open, so they're very much influenced by the weather conditions. They're also very much influenced by the terrain, factors such as the slope, and they're also strongly affected by the type of fuel in which they're burning, the amount of fuel and how that fuel is arranged. Bushfires are commonly described in terms of how fast they're spreading. So we talk about a rate of spread that might be in metres per hour or sometimes in kilometres per hour of spread. We also talk about the size of flames from a fire, and that's a good descriptor because most people can visualise a flame that might be as tall as a person or as big as a house or twice the height of the trees, so it's a good, useful descriptor. We also talk about whether a bushfire is spotting, and by spotting I mean starting fires ahead of the main fire front, and the spotting process happens where you have pieces of flammable material. There might be fragments of bark or leaves or sometimes perhaps pine cones which are drawn up above the fire, so they're lofted into the convection column of the fire, blown downwind by the wind, and then they can start new fires themselves. And under extreme fire weather conditions it's possible to have spot fires that may start many kilometres ahead of the main fire front. The ways that bushfires propagate and spread are influenced by the weather conditions and very much by the type of fuel in which the fire is burning. Fires in grassland, they will spread at speeds of up to 10 or even 15 kilometres per hour under severe burning conditions with dry fuels and strong wind. Forest fires in general will be slower moving than grass and shrub fires, but it is possible to have forest fires that will spread at several kilometres an hour. Under those conditions you'll have what's called a crown fire, so the fire will be spreading through the crowns of the trees. It'll be burning all of the bark and all of the leaves off the tree, so you might have flames that are twice the height of the forest canopy, so perhaps 50 or 60 metres. And under those conditions you would also expect to have very extensive spot fire, so you would have burning firebrands which can be carried many kilometres out ahead of the main fire front, and they will be starting new fires.
To understand how bushfires are controlled, we turn to Superintendent John Tillman from the Department of Fire and Emergency Services.
One of the most challenging situations facing fire agencies during the bushfire season is where we see multiple ignitions simultaneously. A very good example of that is the 2014-15 bushfire season, where we saw a significant dry lightning event throughout the southwest of WA during the period 28th to the 30th of January. During that period, we saw over 75 fires start simultaneously or over a couple of day period. 52 of those occurred on the 29th of January over a large area across the Southwest Land Division. That presents a real challenge for agencies because they need to be able to detect the fires very quickly and to organise a coordinated response between the agencies to suppress the fires where they can. The situation we saw in that period, 28th to the 30th of January 2015, the majority of the fires were able to be suppressed to a very small area and contained to a small area, but we saw a number of fires escalate, predominantly the Lower Hoffman Valley fire and the Northcliffe fire in the very south of the state. The Lower Hoffman fire burnt over 50,000 hectares over a number of days, and the Northcliffe fire burnt nearly 100,000 hectares. When we see fires of such intensity, it's extremely challenging for the aircraft to get in and around the fire due to the smoke plume and the intensity of the fire. I often see it crowning out through the tops of the trees, and the intensity on the ground, of course, is way too intense for crews to be able to manage the fire and effectively construct fire line on the fire edge. In those situations there, all we can do is to wait for conditions to abate, either a change in conditions, relative humidity increasing, temperatures dropping, or the fire running into low fuel areas. And the situation in both those fires was there's very few areas that have been, the fuel loads have been managed through previous prescribed burns or previous bushfires. So that's why we saw such large areas burnt in a single fire event. When we see a situation like we have in the summer of 2014-15, where we have multiple fires ignited simultaneously through a dry lightning event, it's very important that all the fire agencies work cooperatively to detect the fires and coordinate response across the land tenures. Of course, fire doesn't know land tenure, and it's important that we coordinate our response based on the closest resource and also having undertaken a strategic risk assessment, rapid assessment to determine where the fires may have started, what tenure they might be in, what assets or critical infrastructure might be at risk, and also what sort of fuel loading the fire might have started in, so as we understand the potential for the fire to escalate, or if it's in low fuels, whether it can be a lower priority in regard to response. Response is obviously coordinated between the agencies, Parks and Wildlife, Fire and Emergency Services and local government, utilising the resources that exist across the landscape and coordinating response to ensure we respond as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible in suppressing individual fires and recognising the ones that have potential to escalate and potentially threaten life and property.
Bushfire can take life, it can severely damage property and buildings, it can impact on critical infrastructure, important things like bridges, pipelines, major electricity distribution networks. Impact severely on air quality through putting up large amounts of smoke emissions into the atmosphere, and that can affect people's health and can affect the visibility and have impacts on airports and transport, so potentially major economic costs through smoke. So the vulnerable areas tend to be the interfaces of major cities where the suburbs meet the bush. Other vulnerable areas would be some coastal developments where you have houses that are nestled in amongst quite flammable coastal scrub. Also small towns that are set in a forest landscape, of which you'll have a number scattered throughout the southwest forest. They can be quite vulnerable to bushfires because the forest comes right up to the edge of the town. The vulnerability of areas to fire does depend on the sort of vegetation and fuel that we're dealing with. So in forested areas like the southwest, vulnerability and the potential for bushfire tends to be increased by dry conditions, where we have a long-term rainfall deficit, where we have a build-up of fuel, and lots of people living in amongst that vegetation, that certainly increases the potential for damaging bushfires. In agricultural areas of the state and in some of the rangelands, it's almost an opposite cycle where above average rainfall causes good growth of pastures and crops and of native grasslands, and once those grasslands cure off during the dry summer months, then you have additional amount and greater continuity of the fuel, and that can cause the potential for larger and more damaging fires. Some of the research that's been done looking at the actual fire danger, so that's a combination of wind speed and fuel moisture content, that's suggesting that there is some trend for an increased number of days of higher fire danger, and that would fit with the projections of a generally warmer climate.
The fires that we saw during the summer of 2014-15 again demonstrated the importance of a range of activities being undertaken, from prevention, preparedness, right through to having good response capability as well. Agencies certainly can't rely on having response suppression techniques only. Given the fire intensities that we saw, we could see there were situations where suppression on the ground was not effective for considerable periods of days or a number of days. So to be able to manage fires across the landscape, and remembering that fire is a very natural part of the landscape that we live in, we need to learn to live with and manage fire, to manage the fuel loads through a range of techniques, and to ensure that our public and the communities are prepared for living in a situation where fire is quite frequent within the landscape.
The way we manage land is important. If it's bushland managed by Parks and Wildlife or perhaps by local government, then managing the fuels on that bushland is important. It can be done through a number of ways. It can be done through prescribed fire. Generally prescribed fire is done under mild weather conditions, so in the spring period or in the latter part of the autumn.
Given that fire presents a risk right across the landscape, particularly in the southwest of WA, it's very important that landholders and land managers clearly understand the risk the situation that they may be in. And when we talk about critical infrastructure and agencies responsible for critical infrastructure, again, they need to understand the risk that's presented to that critical infrastructure, the importance of that critical infrastructure if it's impacted by fire, and also what can be done to mitigate the risk and reduce the potential for that infrastructure to be impacted or damaged or completely taken out during a bushfire.
In closing, Lockie highlights the importance of contributions from all stakeholder groups in helping to bring about the best possible bushfire management for Western Australia.
If we think about how we manage bushfires in Western Australia at a state level, obviously we're a very large and diverse state, and we range from very densely populated areas in the southwest to very sparsely populated areas through much of the interior and the north. I think that really emphasises the importance of using local knowledge and getting local people involved, be through involvement with local government, through volunteer bushfire brigades, landholders, getting involved with local traditional owner groups, all of whom have something to contribute to how we achieve the best outcomes for managing bushfire.